I don't think we should say that. I think that that is wrong information and it's holding people to a much lower standard. And we shouldn't be saying that. What I will say is that walking is great, but do not count that as exercise.
I'm so glad you said that. It is the strange. I don't know when that started.
I don't know either. And if we don't challenge the way.
I feel it's like the last 5 or 8 years. Like, so walking is exercise?
Hey, what's up, people? Welcome back to the Can't Believe I Made It podcast, where we dig deep into the nuances of health and fitness, challenging popular narratives to bring you a more nuanced perspective. I'm your host, Desi Abeda. In today's episode, we're diving deep into a topic that stirred up quite the conversation in the fitness community. Recently on the Ed Mylett Show, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon made a statement that walking shouldn't be considered exercise, but rather an activity of daily living, describing it as the lowest possible standard. Now, while Dr. Lyon's perspective might come from a place of encouraging more rigorous physical activity, it's essential to address how this viewpoint might be inherently ableist and overlooks the broader spectrum of health benefits that come from walking. Because not everyone can engage in high-intensity workouts due to health conditions, disabilities, age, or even access to equipment and/or gyms. And for many, walking is not only a feasible form of exercise, but it's also a critical one. And as we listen to bits and pieces of the Ed Mylett Show, we'll do a breakdown of a recent STEP study guide that highlighted the significant health benefits that come from regular walking. Contrary to the all-or-nothing approach, research shows that incremental increases in daily steps can lead to substantial improvements in health outcomes. This study emphasizes that every step counts and that walking, for many people, is an accessible and effective form of exercise. So as we unpack today's topic, let's remember the importance of inclusivity in fitness discussions and recognize the value of all forms of physical activity. And stay tuned as we explore how embracing a wider definition of exercise can help us build a healthier, more inclusive community, keeping in mind that you define what it means to be a high-performing human. Let's get it. Hey, what's up, people? I am super excited about this one. I think what I've been doing over the past couple weeks is taking a look at what is really hitting on social media and what some of the overall response is. And so in doing some of my homework as we head into today's episode in our Rituals for Resilience series, I figured this would be perfect because after hearing it, and instead of going straight to wanting to respond to it, I actually wanted to give it a critical view. And in episode 158, when we talked about Andrew Huberman and his apparent cancellation and what this really means for wellness and science communications, I had asked you as a community to be a troll for good, to be a bit more critical about not only the information that you are receiving, but given the time and the effort is going in and trying to understand it. And so after hearing this, I was like, damn, I can't not respond to this. And I say this because anytime that I'm working with someone, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I tend to find when I'm working with them is that as we start them on some sort of ritual around getting their steps in, getting sunlight, we see some tremendous benefit when we're talking about their overall sleep hygiene. What that does is it spills into other areas of their life in regards to fitness and nutrition. And so I'm always a big person on steps. And so I could not dive into this with you all. So as we take this critical eye into some of the communication that's out there and something that went absolutely viral, and a bunch of other wellness creators, including dietitians, coaches, fitness coaches, and those of the same likes responded to it, I wanted to give us an opportunity to take a look at a couple clips here and have some ongoing discussions about not only just what might be inherently false, but also taking a deep dive into the minds of some of these wellness creators and how they create their messaging centered around, and I hate saying this because marketing is such a massive tool, but it's centered around what they are trying to sell to you. Because in most cases, and I'm one just in the same vein, right? I had mentioned in 158 that I wanted to be a bit more honest and critical around the way that I communicate. Listen, any of us who are all creators out there, we're doing it for some sort of measure of either growth, whether that's in their business, their income, or their following. But we're looking at it when we try to provide insight like this, it's because we're looking for some sort of monetary value. And for me, if I'm being perfectly transparent, I've said this from the get-go, I really want to continue to grow this community because I know, you know what, like I would love for this podcast and this community to jump on a network so that we can continue to grow together. And for me, when I first started podcasting, that was something that was a really big goal of mine. And as I continued to get into it, I was like, you know what, if my job was to have these conversations and to have this community, fucking sign me up. Right. And so I think what is really helpful for us is to be extremely critical, not only just about the messaging, but where this person's coming from a background perspective. And so we're going to take little bits and pieces of building on the story and then getting into the actual clip and then actually addressing it with what the science actually says in regards to what walking does for your overall health and your overall benefit. Now, this first clip I wanted to sort of tee up. So a little background on Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. So she mentions in the podcast that she is a board certified physician. She mentions that she has a background in nutritional science. So again, she positions herself as someone who is an expert in the given field. And she coins herself as the muscle doctor, if you will. And if I'm being perfectly frank, I am not against conversations around how to get stronger and what muscle, and in this case, the more emphasis is on skeletal muscle, what that does for our overall longevity. Anytime that I work with the client, one of my biggest themes that I'll let them know is like, hey, I want you to understand what you need to do from a foundation perspective. I want you to understand how to prioritize how you eat, how you move, how you sleep, and also how you think. Right. And so that's kind of like the framework in which I always like to work with clients with. When we look at one big theme in regards to what habit building does in people's lives, I'm always a huge fan of saying, hey, how can we get you strong as hell? If I can make you stronger and a better athlete in your own right so that you can become your own version of that high performing human, then we are a massive success if we work together. And it's kind of the same thing here. So in very layman's terms of what Dr. Gabrielle Lyon's message is she feels like muscle is the longevity factor in reference to overall health over someone's lifespan. And to that end, I don't disagree. If we can continue to help you to build muscle, to be more athletic in your own given situation, it's always going to be a positive thing. So that kind of paints the picture of who this person is. She's actually a physician of Ed Mylett, who is the host of the show, who has a massive following. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon is someone who also across multiple platforms has more than 1 million followers or social impact. So these are people that people listen to. And I think what's really important about this process is really understanding and keying up some of these key notes inside of the current podcast and really looking at it from a critical eye. So let's go ahead and do that in our first clip, which I felt like was a little condescending, and we'll discuss that it's not black and white in the way that we constantly think about in regards to health, obesity, and other things. But let's go ahead and take a listen to it.
Book.
I love that.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Right now, people talk about this obesity epidemic, that we have an obesity epidemic as if it exists over here, and that the diseases that ride along with obesity, for example, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, that these are end results of potentially obesity. But what if I told you that underpinning of all is not obesity? It's actually skeletal muscle.
Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. While I don't disagree that skeletal muscle in this case and or creating lean muscle is not a significant factor when we're talking about overall health and overall health outcomes. But what really bothered me throughout the podcast, and I'm going to encourage you to listen to it, I'm going to go ahead and link it in the show notes, but what really bothered me about the overall podcast is the condescending way in which Dr. Lyon had talked about the obesity epidemic. She put it in quotes oftentimes, and she said it in a way where it's like, it was completely invalidating what's actually going on in the health sphere. But to say that it's just one thing, I think is incredibly and inherently wrong. And why do I say that? We mentioned this in some of the rant episodes that I had in regards to the BMI in earlier episodes of this season. And I think what's really important to note is that obesity is one of those things that is incredibly complex. There's a lot of factors that play into this, because if we look at, once again, the definition of obesity, it's going to be a quantitative definition of a BMI over 30. But in previous discussions, we also know that the BMI is not an accurate tool of navigating overall body fat in an individual, because it doesn't take into account muscle, bone density, and some of the other things that are incredibly important, right? It should not be strictly applied to individuals because of those reasons. Now, if we look at the root cause, right, it's going to be a net energy surplus over time, right? And it's also going to be a multitude of factors that progress into that energy surplus. But if we go a bit deeper, and this is where nuance plays a massive role, because it's not black or white thinking, it's not all or nothing, it's not just skeletal muscle. 100% is taking a look at their daily physical activity level. It's taking a look at sleep quality and quantity. And I think even more so, it's also taking a look at food environment and the prevalence of and the accessibility to energy dense foods, energy dense and highly processed foods, as opposed to foods that are of higher quality. For any of us who have ever gone shopping over the past year, we can kind of understand, if you find yourself getting a container of blueberries, that it's just as much as like double what you're paying in gas, right? So we've seen these numbers. We've seen some of the grocery metrics of what is happening in regards to what we pay for goods and services up until this point. So even then, saying something like that assumes that everyone is starting off in the same bracket, if you will. And we just know that that's inherently not true. Beyond that, we look at your socioeconomic status. Again, not everyone is starting off at the same starting point. And then beyond that, we look at some of the disease states, and then we look at diet composition, quality, and all the other things. So for someone to inherently say that it's just one thing, that right there in itself should be a massive red flag and something that we should think more critically about. Now, to tee off this next section, Dr. Lyon has already positioned themselves as someone who not only has a medical background, but also works with high achieving individuals like Ed Mylett. They mentioned that in a good deal of their back and forth when they first started, and really throughout the podcast, when Ed is constantly talking about, you're my own personal doctor and the doctors of a lot of colleagues and friends. So right away, that already kind of positions you to be thinking that if not only is she highly credentialed, but she's also working with some of the best high performing entrepreneurs in the world, like why shouldn't I listen to her? I think another piece that's incredibly important here is not only has Dr. Lyon positioned herself in this way, but then she's also spitting out a bunch of different qualitative measures that might, to you, possibly think to yourself like, oh, what she's saying is fact. And so I'm going to bring you into a small little snippet of that piece as well.
When you are not moving and you are sedentary, there is this decrease in flux, meaning that those carbohydrates, all of those substrates stay in the muscle unhealthy. It's kind of like this idea of a suitcase. Okay. So you open up a suitcase, and let's say you're going on a trip for 4 days, but you're packing like you're going on a trip for 20. Okay. So you're overpacking all this clothes, and the clothes has nowhere to go. It goes back out of the suitcase. Okay. It's exactly what happens when you don't have healthy skeletal muscle.
Okay, so she's throwing around a lot of terms that to you might be thinking she's talking about energy substrate, she's talking about carbohydrates. She uses an analogy that a lot of us have likely experienced when we're going packing or going on a trip. So as you're thinking to yourself, you're like, wow, she's really positioning herself as someone who knows exactly what they're talking about. So I should be listening. Now, up until this point, she's talking about her expertise. Now, with the Ed Mylett Show, like they have millions and millions upon people inside of the community. But this is where I think we can really take it a step further. So I will say that the way that Dr. Lyon was able to take that analogy and paint that picture for you, you can associate that with, okay, that feels comfortable to me. I can continue listening, and I can continue listening to this expert. But once again, we have to be critical about where the lens is coming from, because Dr. Lyon sells their own programs and their own books and some of her own products that she is either partnered with or that she gets some sort of monetary, throwback from sponsoring them. So again, we need to be thinking critically about the information. And the bigger piece here too is making sure that it fits with some of the things that we are working toward in the long run. I'm not here to shit on Ed Mylett. I'm not here to shit on Dr. Lyon. What I'm here to do is to ask you to think critically about some of the information that goes out there, especially as it pertains to health advice and health content. Now, this next piece is when I feel like it starts to become a bit more unhinged. Let me tell you why. So throughout the course of the podcast, there's a great deal of talk and really a lot of shit talk about overly processed foods. Ed makes mention of, well, why is it that when I eat processed foods, I don't feel full, but versus when I have high quality meat? Friends, that's just the basics of nutrition. Yes, we want things that are higher quality because if you're consuming something that has more volume or has more nutrition, or in this case, they're talking a bit more about protein, something that is going to be a bit more bioavailable so that you can absorb it and helps you to feel full longer, because that's what protein does. Protein and fats help you to keep full or help you to keep satiated over time. Those things inherently are obviously going to help you to feel full versus busting open a bag of chips and feeling like that's going to make you full. So that's a good example of what we're seeing here, and where I think it starts to become a bit more unhinged is they're constantly talking shit on highly processed foods. And listen, as a dietitian, I want you to prioritize nutrient dense foods. And I also recognize, as a busy father myself and someone who's doing the best that he can and has a good stance on solid nutrition and some of the scientific insights behind it, I too will find myself going to something that is processed because that's what I have the time for. I think a perfect example is yesterday. We hadn't gone grocery shopping here in the Abeta household. And so we're doing the best that we can. So I got to go pick up my little girl. I'm with my 2-year-old son, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I need to go pick her up. I need to make sure she has a snack when we get back. And then on top of that, an hour later, we need to have dinner. So what I ended up doing was getting myself a protein shaker. I threw 50 grams of protein in there. We have some Uncrustables that our kids really love. So I grabbed an Uncrustable, I grabbed a piece of fruit, and then I grabbed a Perfect Bar that could help supplement a meal because that's what I had the time for. Now, for someone who is constantly scrutinizing processed foods, you might think to yourself, you're like, oh my God, Desi, that's a shit lunch. But you know what? I met my protein needs. I felt full. I felt satisfied. And I'm totally okay with the balancing act of, did I have protein? Did I have carbohydrates? Did I have fat? And also, did I have color on my plate? So that's one of the principles that I like to live my life by, and something that I really like to inherently discuss with my clients as it pertains to the imperfection of eating just in general. So as we kick off this clip, I want you guys to, again, think critically. Throughout the course of this podcast, they're talking shit on processed foods. And then all of a sudden, there is one type of processed food that is A-okay.
Because people say, oh, well, that's processed.
Right.
That's okay, because I would much rather have someone get a processed source, like a whey protein.
Mm-hmm.
You and I both know for Fellas.
Yes.
I mean, we work with First Form and
Okay, so perfect example right there. She even gives a personal shout out to First Form, right? So throughout the course of the podcast, they're talking shit on some of the plant-based options. They're talking shit on processed foods in general. But however, there is one processed food that's okay, and likely one that benefits them monetarily. Now, again, I'm the type of dietitian who understands that all foods can fit in regards to how we personalize an approach for someone. But this is really one good example of that, because if you look at her Instagram bio, it'll lead you to her website. And as you go into her website, you'll see that she has a book for sale. You'll see that she has a shop, and you'll see that she has products that she recommends. And so as we go into the products, we have First Form, which is a supplement company that does different types of whey proteins, different types of bars, things like that. Right? She also has Element. That is a rehydration supplement. In my personal opinion, unless you're an elite level endurance athlete, it's giving you far too much sodium than you actually need. But that's another podcast for another time. And then beyond that, she does represent better health. I'm a huge proponent of mental health, so I'm totally cool with it. And then she has some other ones. Again, we want to start thinking critically about where this information is coming from, because I think the bigger important piece is that if you have someone who is providing you medical insight into how you should operate with your own habits and your rituals as it pertains to health, we need to look at them with a critical eye. Now, for this last clip, let's go ahead and discuss why we're actually here, which is the clip that actually went viral when her and Ed are talking about how walking is an exercise. And while I think it's important for you to listen to the whole podcast, like I've said numerous amount of times in this episode, I'm going to give you what I wanted to do throughout the episode was to give you a little bit more guidance, to paint a story of some of the things that are talked about If you're someone like myself, sometimes that'll see or read something and you're like, I don't really want to go into that. So I'm going to go with the experts that are going to give me an overview and experts that I can trust. So all that being said, let's go ahead and discuss why we're here and also refute some of the claims that they're talking about with some of the science that we have available, on top of ways that you can build your own skeletal muscle. Because like I said, not everything that Dr. Lyon is saying is complete bullshit. I think there's some ableist and there's some real privilege of where she's coming from. But if we're trying to do this under the veil of making sure that we are literate across a bunch of different platforms, let's go ahead and have these conversations. And that's why we want to think critically about some of the information, not only that we are receiving, but some of the information that we're receiving and actually taking action on. So let's go ahead and open up that clip.
This is a direction.
And it's a very not to do it.
Super easy.
So in general, let's talk about resistance training. How much should somebody do? How regularly? And to any other recommendations
Well, the
correlated
first
with it?
thing that I would love to highlight is that there is this conversation that just some exercise is better than none. I don't think we should say that.
Okay.
I think that that is wrong information and it's holding people to a much lower standard. And we shouldn't be saying that. What I will say is that walking is great. Do not count that as exercise.
I'm so glad you said that. It is the strange. I don't know when that started.
I don't know
Like,
either. And if we don't challenge the way,
I feel it's like the last 5 or 8 years. Like, so walking is exercise?
This is
The hell is that?
this is activity of daily living.
Right, like
Get
humans
after it.
humans walk.
Exactly.
Like, that's not exercise. Like, talk
Exactly.
about the lowest possible standard. Like, I don't mean to offend anybody, but like, I mean, maybe if you haven't worked out in forever, start with a walk. But my gosh, you're not exercising. Come to a gym with me and you'll see someone exercise, right?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I've had to listen to this clip over and over because I wanted to make sure that while I had some feelings about it, I wanted to make sure that I provided some perspective and how I want to operate with this. There's a couple things that I think are important to note here. One, it does seem incredibly inherently ableist for them to assume that everyone has the access to, first of all, the knowledge of how to strength train, or everyone has access to be able to hire a strength coach. Everyone is able to go to a gym or is able to get into some sort of strength training regimen. There's just a lot here to unpack, right? And so I think that's the first piece. The other piece, it does remind me of a very entrepreneurship attitude of how you address not only the people that are listening to you in your communities or the people that you want to sell to. What do I mean by that? I remember very early on when I started my business, when I started coaching people, setting standards for themselves was something that I used to say. And while I don't disagree that we need to set personal standards for ourselves, but to say that you shouldn't set goals, you should set standards seems very salesy to me. It just has some sort of sales veil, if you will. Beyond that, what I think is also important to note is actually addressing what actually went viral in walking is not exercise. We do know that 150 minutes of exercise per week is kind of the gold standard for most people. We also know that 80% of the public are not getting that. And so there's likely some nuance that we need to discuss. And if something becomes too hard for someone from a habit standpoint, we want to dial it down so that they can gain some wins and build on that. That's inside of fitness, that's progressive overload. Inside of nutrition, that's what programming looks like. We set your goals, and if you're not meeting them, we get the homework, or rather the data back that it might be too difficult. And so we dial it down so that we can build again. And that's how we look at this. So now let's take an opportunity to understand and take a look at the actual science. So what we see here is some fascinating findings behind a comprehensive meta-analysis study that widely touted the 10,000 steps a day moniker that we've probably all heard to any degree of our health journey, right? So this study took a look at 47,000 adults, and it provides us nuanced insights into the daily step counts across 15 different studies of all-cause mortality rates. This part is important because any sort of activity is going to benefit you. 100%, yes, if you're someone who can get into the gym and get into a program and continue to get stronger and become more athletic, that's the actual goal. But because there's a great deal of nuance and because we need to understand and program for the types of people that we're working with, these pieces need to be looked at. So the study ended up revealing that the health benefits of walking could be achieved around 6,000 to 8,000 steps. So it went against this 10,000 step health mantra. But again, there's a lot of nuance when it comes to this, because that 6,000 to 8,000 step range had shown that there's a significant health benefit. So whether you're a fitness enthusiast or just trying to stay healthy, the actual study provides us some insight into what getting started does for our overall health and what consistency and taking action does for us. Now, as we come to a close, not only are we thinking a bit more critically about some of the things that go viral in our social media sphere, but I'm also going to give you a couple nuggets, because I'm not going to leave you hanging. Anytime that we do any of these episodes, I want to make sure that you have some things that you can continue to work on and build on your current rituals and habits, so that you become that high-performing human that are within your means, right? And so the first thing that we want to look at, so when we're building skeletal muscle or when we're building muscle, there are some 5 key things that we do want to be thinking about. The first one is, and Dr. Lyon does discuss it in the actual podcast, is taking a look at your protein quality and the overall amount. The kind of baseline for most meals is usually anywhere from 20 to 40 grams. But again, there's a lot of nuance when it comes to that. I like to help people operate between a more or less 1.7 grams per kilogram up until 2. And if you're someone who's an elite level athlete, we can increase that in regards to your personal goals. But right off the bat, your overall quantity throughout the day is going to mean a great deal more than some of the things we might talk about, because overall, we want to make sure that you're providing yourself with enough amino acids, the right type of amino acids, and enough protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And that's the thing that we want to look at. The other thing that we also want to make sure that we prioritize and keep in mind is resistance exercise. Again, if you're someone who doesn't have access to a gym and you're someone who wants to get started, or you're coming back from an injury or something like that, walking can be a perfect commodity, because what I think is really cool about that, and I'm actually seeing that with a friend of mine, shout out to my neighbor, Andy, if you're listening to this, a couple months back, she's been wanting to get back into some sort of fitness regimen. And myself and her husband had challenged her to a step goal. And so she's been crushing it. And over time, she's getting really excited about the progress that she's making. But even in that progress, it's starting to trigger something in her. And I tend to find this a lot with clients, is that as you increase your activity, you start to think about ways that you can habit stack. So as your fitness increases, you start to not only create more confidence for yourself, but you start to see the benefit of what progress looks like, so that this person is starting to think about, all right, what would it look like for me to get in 3 days at the gym, or 3 days in some fitness classes or things like that. And that's where I think is you can't really measure that type of growth. That's just something that happens within habit formation. So I think those pieces are massively important. The other thing that we need to look at is the timing of protein. Yes, there's not necessarily a quote unquote recovery window. However, if you're someone who goes out, does a strength training session, and you're hungry afterwards, that's a perfect time to replenish yourself with very fast absorbing types of protein. That's why whey protein is something that is so popular, is because it's relatively cheap and it's incredibly bioavailable. And the other thing that we want to be looking at too is obviously the additional nutrients. So this is where the balancing act of balancing your macronutrients and balancing your micronutrients are incredibly important, because if you're not eating enough and you're trying to gain muscle, inherently that's going to stunt your effort. Okay. And now that we've addressed that walking is in fact inherently exercise, if you look it up in the damn dictionary, it's a form of physical activity. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I want to pose a couple questions to you as it pertains to some of the information, not only that you're receiving, but some information that you can actually apply. So my first question for you as we come to a close in our pod heading into this next week is, one, what is one area or focus that you have been avoiding that you can start to become a bit more curious about? Because what Dr. Lyon does discuss in some of the podcasts is some of the limiting belief. And while I don't necessarily agree that you shouldn't set goals, you should set standards, what she does talk about is we do have limiting beliefs for ourselves. And oftentimes those are the things that are going to stunt our effort. So whether that is your limiting belief around not having time, or your limiting belief around, I don't want to wait that long for the results, these are things that we want to be thinking about. And the last question I want to ask you is, as you start to continue to consume wellness content and start to take some of that information into your health efforts, how can you be more critical of some of the information? maybe you don't have access to the same scientific journals, or maybe you haven't had the privilege of being able to have years and years in school of training of how to look at this. But who are the people that you trust that you can continue to go back to, ask questions and things like that? Well, friends, that's it for me. Another episode of the Can't Believe I Made It podcast. I hope you're enjoying these episodes. I think as I continue to dive into some of the social media content, I can't not talk about some of the things with you all. So I'm incredibly excited about not only just future episodes, but continuing to tackle some of these topics. If you have one that you have some questions about, feel free to send it over, whether it's DM, you got my number, shoot me a text. I would love to dive into it. You guys have a beautiful weekend. I will catch you on the next one. Let's get it.